Chapter 14. Adult visitors were rarely allowed to attend meetings of the Sacred and Solemn Order of Wolf, but Prince Liu Pao was not the normal kind of visitor. The moon was very bright. I listened for a treble owl hoot, and replied with 2 cat yowls, and a boy slipped from the shadows and led us through a maze of thick brush to the side of a low cliff. The Prince and Master Li and Moon Boy and Grief of Dawn and I got down on our knees and crawled through an opening, and when we stood up we were inside a small cave. 13 boys, 11 to 14 years old, greeted us formally. The occasion was the induction of the 13th little skinhead into the elite boys' gang of the Valley of Sorrows, and we would be allowed to stay until they got to matters like codes and passwords. A single torch burned at the back of the cave. Lying on the floor beneath it was the skeleton of a boy who had been about the same age as the members of the gang. It was a very ancient skeleton, and the boy's death had been dramatic. The rib cage was crushed, and inside it lay the iron head of an old spear. We followed the gang's examples and bowed to the bones. The leader was called Deer Ears. "We bow to Wolf, as have our fathers and grandfathers before us," Deer Ears formally announced. "We gather in his honor, and our distinguished guest will be allowed to add one detail to his story." The boys sat in a semicircle facing the skeleton. We sat just behind them, and Deer Ears picked up an ancient ring from the skeleton's separated finger bones. He handed it politely to the prince, who examined it and passed it around. The ring was black iron, and engraved on the front with the head of a wolf. Master Li studied the inside of the ring with interest. There were faint lines and markings that made no sense to me. We handed the ring back to Deer Ears, and he reverently replaced it. There was a brief ceremony for the purification of the boy to be inducted, little skinhead, but sacred matters would be saved for later, after we had gone. When Deer Ears began the story of Wolf, I was disappointed. It was like 1,000 such stories, and I could almost predict what would happen next. A woodcutter finds a baby in a basket on his doorstep. Around the baby's neck is a cord holding a ring and a small clay tablet. Neither the woodcutter nor his wife can read, so they take the tablet to a priest, who reads to them. When the finger fits the ring, take the boy to Temple Spring. They have no children themselves, so they decide to raise the child as their own, and since the ring has the head of a wolf on it, they name him Wolf. When the boy is 12 years old, the ring fits his finger, so the woodcutter takes him to the Temple of the Spring of the Master, which is renowned for handling all sorts of strange matters. A priest searches the record and says that, according to instructions left 12 years before, Wolf is now old enough to be told that he has a cousin living in Lingchao Valley, a very clever fellow known as the Artificer. Wolf is to go to his cousin, but no other information has been left to guide him. The priest also hands Wolf a simple wooden bow, which seems to be his only inheritance except for the ring, and with many tears Wolf parts with his foster parents, and sets off to seek his destiny. The Artificer is a classic villain. The greedy, mean fellow accepts the boy as slave labor and works him half to death, but Wolf at least discovers that his mother died in childbirth, and his father was named Li Tan, and was perhaps the greatest artificer of them all. Wolf's father then fell under the spell of a concubine of the lord of the neighboring valley, the Valley of Sorrows. The concubine was a witch. She was a barbarian called Crown of Fire because of her bright red hair, and she had a daughter called Fire Girl, who was Wolf's age. The witch and Wolf's father had attempted to assassinate the lord, the Laughing Prince, and had been put to death. But their infant children had vanished, and thus were spared. "One day," said Deer Ears, "a mysterious stranger appeared at the Artificer's door. They talked in low voices for many hours, and then Wolf was called in. When he saw the stranger's face, Wolf felt a shudder of fear because Wolf wasn't afraid of anything," the little skinhead said indignantly. He had the right spirit for a recruit. Wolf felt a shudder of fear because the stranger's face was as white as death, Deer Ears hissed. sick, slimy, fish-belly white, and the stranger's heart was so cold that his eyes had turned blue, and a red beard crawled over his face like a hairy spider, and he was drunk, Little Skinhead said matter-of-factly. My father took me to Su Chao, where there are lots of barbarians, and barbarians are always drunk. He hadn't hit the wine jars, and don't interrupt, Deer Ears yelled. He told Wolf he was a trader with a caravan on its way to Samarkand with a cargo of, Deer Ears paused and looked thoughtfully at the guests. We could add one unimportant detail to the story, and nobody had yet bothered with the cargo. He bowed to the prince, who deferred to Master Li. Slavonian squirrels, Master Li said, intoning the words like a priestly chant. Undressed vares, and varebellies, and backs. Martens and finches, goatskins and ramskins, dates, filberts, walnuts, salted surgeon tails, round pepper, ginger, saffron, cloves, nutmeg, spike, cardamoms, scammony, manna, lac, zedori, incense, quicksilver, copper, amber, pounding pearls, borax, gum arabic, sweetmeats, gold wire, wines, dragon's blood rubies, loaded dice, and beautiful dancing girls. Only Master Li would have tossed in loaded dice and beautiful dancing girls, and the boys sat in reverent silence while they absorbed it. For the next 10 or 12 centuries, Master Li's cargo would be part of the tale of Wolf. Deer Ears' voice changed to a nastily wheedling whine. What's a fine boy, the stranger said. What a clever and manly boy! I have just the task for such a boy, and he who performed it would receive 6 shiny copper coins. Wolf looked at him silently. The stranger's face contorted with terrible pain. All right, 7, he shrieked. You see, I have a niece, a wild and ungrateful girl, who has stolen a gem and swallowed it to conceal the theft, and she has slipped into a small cave at the end of the valley. The entrance is too small for a man, but a clever boy could squeeze inside and bring my niece back. Wolf wants no part of it, but the artificer insists, so he takes his ring and his bow and a torch and squeezes through a small opening into a dark cave. Then the story got very interesting indeed, at least so far as I was concerned, and since it proved to be of use to Master Li, I will set down as much of the important parts as I can remember. Wolf Boy and Fire Girl. Wolf lit the torch and looked around. There was nobody in the cave, but there was a dark corner, and when he walked over he stared in astonishment at a smooth flight of stone steps leading down. Wolf's eyes gleamed, and he thought of buried treasure, and he strung his bow, and made sure he could quickly reach his knife, and started down the stairs. The steps led on and on, winding sharply downward, and Wolf began to hear the sound of running water. Finally, something sparkled in the torchlight, and he realized it was an underground river in the center of an immense cavern. The water was jet black, the color of the stone bed it ran through. To his right was a glow, and he moved cautiously toward it, and came to the first of a long line of torches set in brackets on the stone walls. The light was good enough for Wolf to extinguish his own torch. A small crimson boat was tied to a post. There was another post beside it, and it was stained with drops of water. The stain was still damp, and Wolf untied the little boat and climbed in and pushed off into the current. Enormous statues carved in stone lined the banks. Wolf gazed in wonder at statues with the bodies of humans, but the heads of animals or birds. What could they mean? The cavern was silent, except for the hiss of torches and the lapping of water. Nothing stirred. The boat drifted on and on. Everything was black or white or gray, except for the orange glow of the torches. But then Wolf saw a flash of crimson. He steered the boat over to a shelf of rock overhanging the side of the river, and beneath it was a crimson boat just like his. He tied his boat beside it and swam to the bank and climbed out, and he saw a trail of sandal prints, still damp, leading up over a mound of tumbled rocks. Wolf began to climb, following the prints, and he reached a small, level area. Something landed on his back and knocked him to the ground. A knife flashed in front of his face, and a small arm tried to jerk his head back. Wolf kicked and rolled over, pinning the knife beneath him, and managed to get to the top position. He was looking at a girl about his own age, and she was half Chinese and half barbarian, and her hair was the color of fire. She hissed like a cat and fought furiously, but Wolf was stronger, and he managed to pin both arms. And then the boy and the girl stopped fighting. Men were approaching, down at the riverbank. They heard coarse laughter and the clash of weapons, and something in the voices made Wolf and the girl break apart and crawl to the edge of the rocks and peer down. The soldiers had cruel, brutish faces, and they wore the uniform of the Laughing Prince, and Wolf realized that the cavern must run all the way to the Valley of Sorrows. The soldiers marched away and disappeared in shadows, and Wolf and the girl sat up. Something was very strange. They should be in darkness, but they were silhouetted against light, and they realized that each of them had something on their backs that glowed. It was Wolf's bow, and one of the arrows in the girl's quiver, and they held them out and stared in wonder. Writing had appeared on the bow and the arrow, writing in fire. Wolf glanced at the girl and blushed. "I don't know how to read," he whispered. "I can read a little." The girl took Wolf's bow and scratched her head and wrinkled her nose and read slowly and hesitantly, "In darkness languishes the precious stone. When will its excellence enchant the world?" She took her arrow and scratched her head some more and wrinkled her nose some more and read, "The precious stone, hidden away, longs to fulfill its destiny." They stared at each other. Finally, Wolf said, "I am called Wolf, and my father was Li Tan, the artificer. I never knew him, and he left me this bow and a ring." "I am called Fire Girl, and my mother was Crown of Fire, the witch," the girl said. "I never knew her, and she left me this arrow." "They say that my father and your mother tried to kill the Laughing Prince," Wolf said. "Is that barbarian traitor really your uncle? He said you stole something, but I don't believe him." "Stole something?" The girl turned and spat furiously. "He is called Brushbeard the Barbarian, and he was taking me to sell as a concubine to the Laughing Prince, just as he once sold my mother. And when I get a chance, I'm going to kill him." As they talked, the glowing letters on the bow and arrow faded away, but now a third glowing light had appeared. It came from the ring on Wolf's finger, and he slipped it off. No writing had appeared, but the strange lines and marks on the inside were shining brightly. Wolf examined the markings closely, and saw that not all of the lines were glowing. The shining lines were running between parallel rows of dark ones, twisting and turning through openings. "Could it be a map through a maze?" Fire Girl whispered. Wolf turned the ring to display more scratchy lines on the front. "Look, these lines start at the wolf head and run to the edge, and then around and inside the ring, like going into a hole or a tunnel. And the shining lines twist through all these little openings into a circular mark and stop there." The girl grabbed his arm. "There's a statue farther on that has a wolf head, just like this one," she said excitedly. Without another word, they slid back down to the riverbank and ran until they came to the huge stone wolf statue. They looked for some mark or sign, but found nothing. The eyes of the wolf head were fixed on a shadowed section of the stone wall, and when they followed the direction of the eyes, they found a tiny side tunnel that was almost invisible. Wolf and Fire Girl managed to squeeze through the opening. The ring was shining even brighter, and the eyes of the wolf were like small lanterns. There were many side passages, but Wolf followed the pattern of the lines inside the ring, and to be on the safe side, they used their knives to scratch marks at the entrances when they turned into different passages. They twisted and turned through a maze, and ahead of them was a light, and finally they stepped into a small round cave. The light came from a natural chimney that ran up through stone to a patch of blue sky and a shaft of sunbeams. The cave had a table and 2 benches. On the floor was a stack of torches, and across from them were 2 sleeping pallets. pallets. Between the pallets was a natural stone shelf. On the shelf were 3 bronze caskets, and the same legend was carved in the stone above the 2 end ones. The caskets had sliding lids carved in fish shapes, and Fire Girl studied the legends above the end ones and read, "Pull not the scales till all else fails." The casket in the center had 2 lids that folded together, with the yin symbol on the left and the yang symbol on the right, and above it on the wall were the 4 ideographs Tung Ling Pao Yu. "Stone of penetrating spiritual power," Fire Girl read. Wolf opened the center casket. Inside was a piece of stone. It was small and slim and as sharp as a razor, and it was shaped like the head of an arrow. Fire Girl picked it up. On each side were 2 written lines, and after much scratching and nose-wrinkling she read the 4 lines together. "When evil is taken for wisdom, wisdom becomes evil. When cruelty is taken for virtue, virtue becomes cruelty. The stone defeats cruelty and evil, and flies to the heart of Liu Shang." "Fire Girl, Liu Shang is the name of the Laughing Prince," Wolf said. When Fire Girl held up the tip of the arrow, her mother had left her. He realized it had no head. There was a groove for one. She slowly took the stone and slid it into the groove, and it stuck there, as though it had been bound with rawhide. She lifted the arrow and placed the center of the shaft on her finger. It was perfectly balanced. "What do you think we should do?" she asked quietly. Wolf looked around. The chimney that ran up to the surface was against a wall, and he walked over and found foot and handholds. He jumped and grabbed and began to climb. It was a long way up, but the holds were good, and finally he stuck his head from the hole and saw that he had come up at the bottom of a deep gorge. Across from the hole he saw a good landmark, strange red and emerald-colored rocks in the side of the cliff, and he began climbing back down. "You can climb that," he said, panting. "If we have to, we can get out quick. Fire Girl, I think that my father and your mother wanted us to try to kill the Laughing Prince if they failed. But I don't know anything about him. Why should he be killed?" She shook her head. "I don't know, but I think we'd better find out," she said. They held hands and began retracing their steps through the maze to see what they could see. Here I will summarize, since the details were not important to Master Li. They discover the terrible destruction of the Valley of Sorrows and the awful torture chamber in the grotto. They also discover that the instruments of torture are made by the Artificer, and that the girls who please the Laughing Prince before being sent to the grotto are sold to him by Brushbeard the Barbarian. They are chased by soldiers, and find out from a cricket how to steal food. The wolf-head statue can talk a few words, and warns them of a geyser of poisonous steam. It also tries to warn them about bats, but bats can mean 40 other things unless pronounced with proper inflection. And since the statue can't move its lips, they don't understand the warning. Each is captured and saved by the other, and they discover the throne room that the Laughing Prince has built in the cavern. They make traps by placing sharpened stakes in pits and covering the tops with mats that look like rock, and digging beneath boulders high on the slopes of rock piles. They agree that the Laughing Prince must be killed, and the only chance is when he holds court in the cavern. They crawl up a tunnel that overlooks the throne room, and discover that both the Artificer and Brushbeard the Barbarian are among the dignitaries. The Laughing Prince appears and sits on his throne. "Can you reach him?" Wolf whispered. Fire Girl shook her head and handed the bow and arrow to Wolf. The Laughing Prince wore a monk's robe, like the monks of mirth who flanked the throne, except that his robe was not motley. His face was in the shadows of a cowl, but evil, glittering eyes pierced through the shadows like pinpoints of cold fire. He reached back and fed what might have been human liver to the 7 black bats that perched upon the back of the throne, and he laughed with the sound of icicles breaking. Wolf notched the arrow and slowly drew it back. His muscles strained to hold the feathers steady beside his right ear. Carefully, he lifted the bow to the best elevation for a long shot. The sharp stone tip glittered in torchlight, and 7 bats flapped up into the air. The high, shrieking squeals echoed through the cavern. "Master, oh master, an arrow is near, shining bright on the tip of the stone that you fear." The glittering eyes of the laughing prince swept over the cavern. Icicles seemed to rush into the tunnel. Wolf tried to release the arrow, but his fingers were frozen. His arm was frozen. He felt ice enter his body and crawl toward his heart. Fire Girl grabbed the bow and arrow and pulled back with all her might. The icicle eyes shifted, and she was frozen. 7 black bats were streaking toward them. "Master, oh master, a boy and a girl, with a wolf on a ring and fire in each curl." "My thieving niece." "He's brought 4 gold pieces to the man who can bring her to me." "Oh, all right, 5, screamed Brushbeard the barbarian, leading a platoon of soldiers across the cavern. "Bring me my ungrateful little cousin, dead or alive," howled the artificer, leading another platoon of soldiers. The laughing prince shifted his eyes to his monks of mirth, and Wolf and Fire Girl fell back as though icy chains had snapped. Now there was no hope of a clear shot, and they turned and ran back down the tunnel. They reached the central cavern just ahead of the soldiers. Arrows whistled past their ears as they dove into the river, and spears probed the water as they swam beneath the black surface to the other side. They climbed out and raced toward a side tunnel, but Brushbeard the barbarian and his men were right behind them, shouting in triumph. Wolf and Fire Girl began counting silently. 10 yaks and 1, 10 yaks and 2, 10 yaks and 3. They leaped as far as they could. 10 yaks and 1, 10 yaks and 2, 10 yaks and 3. They leaped again, and behind them came terrible screams, and 7 black bats flew shrieking through the cavern. "Master, oh master, your brave soldiers die in deep hidden pits where sharpened stakes lie." Where was Fire Girl? Wolf stopped and turned back and saw her standing calmly in the center of the tunnel. The sacred arrow was back in her quiver. A plain one was fixed in the bow, and the feathers held steadily beside her ear. A gross figure was moving forward, clinging to the wall and sobbing with terror. "Dear uncle, a gift from my mother," Fire Girl said softly. The arrow whined like a wasp, and Brushbeard the barbarian clutched his throat and tried to pull the shaft out. Blood spurted, and he collapsed to the floor, writhing and gurgling. Fire Girl turned and ran back to Wolf, and they raced on. The tunnel exit was high on the cavern wall, at the top of rock mounds, and soldiers below at the riverbank looked up and pointed and yelled in triumph. Wolf and Fire Girl dodged arrows as they raced along a narrow path, pulling wooden braces from beneath the traps they had set. 7 black bats shrieked towards the ceiling. "Master, oh master, to a trap have we rushed. Beneath falling boulders your soldiers are crushed." Where was Wolf? Fire Girl stopped and looked around and saw him sliding back down the rock slope with his knife between his teeth. The artificer shrieked in fear and swung his sword. Wolf ducked beneath it. The artificer screamed and fell, trying to pull the hilt of the knife from his stomach. Blood gushed from his mouth, and he jerked over the floor. Wolf turned and scrambled back up the rocks to Fire Girl, and they raced on. There were no more side passages until they reached their secret tunnel. They were in the open, and 7 black bats were flapping above their heads. "Master, oh master, the quarry runs here. No escape to the front and none to the rear." A cold wind whistled through the cavern. Wolf and Fire Girl turned and gazed in horror at the spectre of evil incarnate. A great black bat was flying toward them. The wings spanned at least 40 feet, and the fangs glittered like huge spears, and a royal crown was on its head, and the eyes were the eyes of the laughing prince. They had almost reached the wolf statue, and there was one last trap. It had been intended for soldiers who might pursue on a barge, and Wolf dove for a rope and pulled. A great boulder broke free and rolled like thunder down the slope and shot out into the air, and the splash as it hit the river sent up a blinding curtain of spray. Hidden by water, they dashed to the wall and slipped into the tiny entrance, and then followed the maze back to their cave. Behind them they could faintly hear the shrieks of 7 black bats. "Master, oh master, the quarry has fled. We shall search every crack till their bodies lie dead." Fire Girl sat on the floor, exhausted. Her eyes were closed. When she finally opened them, she saw Wolf standing at the chimney, looking up at the shaft of sunlight. Sounds of soldiers were coming down the chimney as the army of the Laughing Prince searched outside the cavern as well as in. "I'm going to take a look," he said. His eyes were large and grave as he looked at her. "Wait for me, Fire Girl." He scrambled up the chimney and paused at the top. Then he was gone. Fire Girl closed her eyes again. Then they opened wide. "There's the boy!" a soldier shouted from above. "Red hair! There's the girl, too! They're both outside!" yelled another soldier. Fire Girl jumped to her feet. Red hair? A girl up with Wolf? Her eyes fell on the stone shelf between the sleeping pallets, and widened even farther when she saw that the casket on the left was open. She walked over and looked solemnly at the legend above it. "Pull not the scales till all else fails." The casket was empty, except for a tiny strand of something red. On the bottom of the casket was writing, and Fire Girl scratched her head and wrinkled her nose. "A boy who dies, dies not in vain. The great wheel turns, he comes again." Wolf had taken something red to pretend he had red hair, and he was leading the soldiers away from Fire Girl. They would catch him, of course, but she might escape. Fire Girl walked to the last casket on the right. The fish scale lid slid down. She reached inside and lifted a small vial of pale liquid. On the bottom of the cask was writing, "A girl who grieves and drinks of this will be awakened with a kiss." Fire Girl walked over and lay down on her pallet. She brushed her hair with her fingers and straightened her tunic. She carefully placed the bow and the arrow with the stone top on the floor beside her, and opened the vial. The liquid smelled fresh and clean, like forest herbs after a rain. "Yes, Wolf, I will wait," she said softly, and she lifted the vial and drank. Her eyes closed, and she slept. The great wheel turns, a boy will grow. His cave is kept for him to know. Again the ring of Wolf will glow, and the secret passage show. A touch of lips will open eyes, a girl of fire will thus arise. Then the sacred arrow flies, and the heart of evil dies. "The poetry is atrocious, but there's real merit in parts of the tale," Master Lee said as we walked back down the hill in the moonlight. "Yes, indeed," the prince said enthusiastically. "I always knew my ancestor had icicle eyes, and the soul of a 40-foot bat." "I think it's a glorious story," said Grief of Dawn. "I even like the poetry," Moonboy confessed. "It's sheer genius," I cried. "Any one of those boys could be the reborn Wolf, so they have to spend endless hours looking for omens. Even if they aren't Wolf, they'll be officers in his army, so they have to prove themselves through ordeals, spending the night alone in the forest of sopping ghosts, for example, or packing fire drug into a hole beneath terrible-tempered Wu's bad luck jar. So when Wu explodes it during the spring festival, he'll return to Earth somewhere in Tibet. And bats! They'll have to figure out how to handle those bats, and that means secret dark places, lots and lots of cobwebs and spiders. They'll practice setting nasty traps and learn spells to ward off the evil eye. I used to think my old gang was special, but the 7 bloody bandits of the Dragon Bones Cave shouldn't be allowed to bow to the sacred and solemn order of Wolf." Master Lee was regarding me with rather cool eyes. "Perhaps the extraordinary references to a stone are worthy of minor mention," he said wryly. The example of Wolf and Fire Girl gave me backbone. Damn it, it's genius! Centuries ago the boys who found the cave realized that if they chose as their hero a skeleton with a spearhead inside the crushed rib cage, it would be a hero who had somehow failed. So they pieced together bits and pieces from old heroic stories and produced a tale that I admire, except for the poetry," said Master Lee. "The poetry is abominable. The most admirable thing about the tale is its folk-epic nature, meaning that the words take on a quasi-religious significance. Did anyone notice Dear Ears' delivery?" I hadn't, but Grief of Dawn had. His head was thrown back, and his eyes were closed, she said. Once he said which, and hastily changed it to that. He was like my dear old Tai-Tai, preserving the exact wording of an ancient story, just as her parents and grandparents had preserved it. Master Li gazed at her fondly. "Let me know if you can use some extra adoration between visits from these three gentlemen," he said. "That's the point about their references to the stone. Dear Ears came very close to the inscription above the sacristies, and two of the lines were exact. In darkness languishes the precious stone. When will its excellence enchant the world?" Prince Liu Pao threw his hands wide apart. "Yes, but what is the stone?" he asked plaintively. "According to the boys' story, it's a magical thing that slays evil, but my ancestor kept and worshipped it, which scarcely makes sense unless he was in love with the idea of suicide. According to Su Ma and the author of Red Chamber, it's the embodiment of all evil. According to Ox's dream, it's an overpowering life force. Is it good? Is it evil? Is it anything more than a legend? I hate to say this, but much as I enjoy the story of Wolf, it leads us nowhere." "Prince, I must respectfully disagree," said Master Li. "Somehow he gave me the impression of a conjurer who intended to reach into a 2-inch pillbox and pull out a 20-foot pole. Remember those mysterious fellows in robes of motley who are somehow able to pop up out of nowhere and disappear the same way? Well, I strongly suspect that the cavern in the story is actually the tomb of the Laughing Prince, which means that the tomb is far larger than we had imagined. With daylight, we'll put the theory to the test."